Hello there, I'm Toby Haydock, and they would not believe half the things I have seen. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about never quite being good enough for the people who spend most of their lives obsessing about you. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your deadly scimitars from your temporal limiters, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series, one episode at a time. In this edition, it's an instalment which features some beautifully funny lines, the regulars taking a back seat at the climax, and the series' first non-cliffhanger ending. So join me, Toby Haydock, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, Assassin at Peking, or Cathay, come home. First broadcast on the 4th of April 1964 at 5:30 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, with guest stars Mark Eden and Derren Nesbitt. It was written by John Lucarotti, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by Waris Hussein. It was watched by 10.4 million people, and the audience appreciation figure was 59. Ian, Ping Cho and Tigana are escorted to Khan's palace by Ling Tao. The Doctor is excelling at backgammon, but on the last game gambles everything in order to get his ship back, but fails, and so loses the TARDIS. Marco admits he only gave the Khan the ship in order to be granted passage home, whilst Ping Cho discovers that her husband has died, thus freeing her from her obligation. Tigana's real motives are exposed too late to prevent him from entering the throne room with the Khan at his mercy. The When. 13th of January 1964. The date of the earliest version we have of John Lucarotti's script for this episode, which is altered over the next few weeks, but ready in time for filming on the serial, which begins today with sequences from earlier instalments. This script contains a very different end sequence, whilst other amendments are also made during production. 15th of January 1964. The first work on episode 7 of Marco Polo is done today, and it's a biggie. The fight scene between Marco Polo and Tigana, which is arranged by Derek Ware, who has already worked on the series, choreographing the caveman battle in The Firemaker and doubling for Derek Newark. Here, he teaches Mark Eden and Derren Nesbitt to do battle with scimitars for this set-piece sequence, which takes place on the throne room set and is given an extra visual dimension by having supporting artistes Peggy Sir and Roy Vincente on hand for cutaway shots of them as the fight moves around the area. Hussein's PA Douglas Camfield has more affinity for action scenes than the director himself, and so he takes care of the execution of the sequence from a concept established by the director. There is no dialogue between the duellers, and so the sequence is worked out entirely in terms of choreography, which is worked out by Camfield, Ware and Hussein, and independently of the writer. 16th of January 1964. More work is done to complete this complex fight sequence, once again on stage 3B at Ealing Studios. 23rd of January. Although studio rehearsals are not due for a few weeks, even new artistes are in place this early due to the relatively complex nature of makeup and costuming requirements. Cast as the Empress for this episode is Claire Davenport, who receives confirmation of this in a letter written to her by Waris Hussein's secretary today. Hussein has already worked with Davenport. She donned a bald wig and manned up for him as the Queen's assistant in Caesar and Cleopatra at the Oxford Playhouse in 1961. 13th of February. Claire Davenport has her costume fitting today, almost a month before rehearsals. In a week's time, she'll have a session with her wig fitter too. 19th of February. More costume fittings today, with attention given to background artistes Doreen Tang, Suchin, Iris Loy and Suksi Sung, as well as Xenia Merton, returning for the final time as Ping Cho. The extras will all need a wig fitting next Monday, apart from Suk Hee Sung, who is scheduled for Wednesday, 4th of March. 27th February. Dressing room allocations are requested for the episode's cast, with quiet rooms requested for series star William Hartnell and senior actor Martin Miller playing Kubla Khan. Such is the unfamiliarity of names emanating from foreign shores, the request emphasises that Tutti Lemko, playing Kuichu, is a male and therefore not to be billeted with any of the women. 2nd of March. Billings with cast and crew details are sent out to the Radio Times, including the enticing blurb for this final episode. The Doctor loses a game and Tigana seizes his chance. 3rd of March. The Leicester Mercury profiles an actress appearing at the Phoenix Theatre, whose biggest role in the city has been in the play The Hostage. She will soon be seen, however, in the BBC TV serial Doctor Who. You'll see a Chinese empress who is actually from Lancashire. It describes the actress in question, the previously mentioned Claire Davenport, as modest about her achievements. 6th of March. Script editor David Whittaker has given Lucarotti's last draft a polish, for a new version of Assassin at Peking is distributed today, just before rehearsals begin, although there is still a lengthy TARDIS coda, even in this one. 9th of March, 1964. Rehearsals begin for Assassin at Peking at the Drill Hall, 239 Uxbridge Road, between 10:30am and 5:50pm, 6pm on Wednesday, until Thursday the 12th. Claire Davenport is on £42 for her sole episode of Doctor Who, the same as Peter Lawrence as the Vizier. The two lowest paid actors this week are the relatively inexperienced Xenia Merton and Paul Carson, both on, as for their previous instalments, £36.15. Of the guest actors, Nesbitt and Miller are the highest paid, at £84 each, more than title role actor Mark Eden at £68.05, and regular cast member Carol Ann Ford, who's on £63. All the cast, though, earn overtime this week, with Merton and Carson doing the most additional hours to bulk up their relatively paltry wage. Today is also the deadline for the preliminary billings to be sent to the Radio Times. The final deadline falls in 10 days' time. Also today, 3 additional extras are booked for the episode. Gordon Bremworth and Carlton Nui, replacing Robert Chow and Lloyd Lamb, are contactable via Basil Tang, who was the office foreman last week and seems to be the contact point for a number of the Chinese extras. David Anderson, a judo man who Douglas Camfield has met, is brought in to play a guard who gets knocked out. He's not really a stuntman, but Camfield is helping him out and will continue to do so for the next couple of years. A number of the female Chinese extras are supplied by Mr. Kum's agency, Mr. Kum being Christopher Kum, who later appears as Fu Peng in The Mind of Evil. 10th of March. Attention is turned to the final shot, for which Hussein requires a starscape to superimpose over the lead quartet gathered in the TARDIS. He has previously discussed what is possible with Alf Cowling of the graphics department, and as a result requests a caption of the night sky in outer space, not as many stars as in the Milky Way. 12th of March. In an admirable display of prioritising, Verity Lambert's secretary Val Speyer books rooms S3 and 4 at Lime Grove from 9:45pm onwards for the party for the camera crew of Marco Polo. Mervyn Pinfield has spoken to the steward of the club about supplying bottles of drinks and, displaying the scientific aptitude that got him the associate producer's job, has informed Speyer that there are 8 glasses to a bottle of wine. Speyer also informs Lambert about the relatively inexpensive cost of photo prints from those taken by the on-set photographer. There have been numerous photo sessions from this story, and Hussein and costume designer Daphne Dare have both requested copies. The photographer has been booked for this week's recording as well. More related to the actual episode, Barry Newbury, the designer, has the extra £80 he has requested to supplement his design budget signed off. 25 of this is to extend the hire of props, which have been retained for the whole serial. 13th of March. Assassin at Peking is recorded at Studio D, Lime Grove, with work scheduled to begin at 10:30 a.m. Things don't get off to a good start when the health and safety regulations interfere with the erection of the set. Work is supposed to cease at 9:45 p.m, but after scheduled recording finishes, the 4 regulars, plus Eden, Miller, Merton, Davenport, Carson and Lawrence, all stay behind and complete their work, overtime, at 9:57 p.m. This episode has had a massive 9 recording breaks, which is something of a special dispensation. 17th of March. It's good news for Waris Hussein's budget. The wardrobe and makeup department reduced their charge for the episode by £50. It's been quite a big job for the designers. Lots of wigs, with even Eden not sporting his own hair, whilst the blonde Nesbit has a dark wig and false beard and moustache added. Martin Miller has long nails fixed on as well as his wig, moustache and beard, whilst Davenport's look, as well as the wig and the nails, is instructed to include facial makeup applied in order to give her an
exaggerated pursed mouth.
More cost savings come from the fact that some of the male extras can double up. In some scenes, they're given coverings. To quote the costume department,
"Face kerchiefs to be worn like twag veils across lower face. These can hide the faces of the gents, so that at court without them they may not seem the same."
24th of March. Donald Wilson has looked into the timing problems that occurred on the recording day, telling Lambert that it seems to be generally understood that for years the problem of equipment storage on D-Stage has led to difficulty in beginning lighting on any show with a one-day stand. This has usually been overcome by a tactful PA and a realistic fireman getting together. On this occasion, it seems the old boy network sprang a leak, and the always possible situation arose where everyone decided to stick to the strict letter of the rules. There is only one way to avoid this, and that is to make sure directors and designers use only the amount of space in Studio D which can be filled with sets without overflowing onto the necessary storage space. It could be said that this adds to the already difficult problem of making Doctor Who in Studio D, but my opinion is that this problem will only be exaggerated if the directors and designers demand more of the studio than it is capable of supplying. Please see to it that all directors and designers bear this in mind as long as Doctor Who is being produced in D. 4th of April. Assassin at Peking is broadcast on BBC television. At 10.4 million viewers, it gets the largest audience for the story, after last week's episode, which got the lowest at 8.4 million. The appreciation figure mirrors that of the previous 2 instalments, with a workmanlike 59, suggesting that once the novelty has worn off, episode 1 got the highest, at 63, audiences are keen for funkier horizons than those encountered on the journey to Cathay. The episode does, however, get the series into the television audience measurement regional charts top 10 for the very first time, hitting 9th spot in the Tyne Tees region. Also broadcast today is a Doctor Who sketch on Big Night Out on commercial rival ABC TV, which services the Midlands and the North. Starring comedian brothers Mike and Bernie Winters, the show mounts Dr. Shmoo, with Bernie Winters as Dr. Shmoo, whose clothes fall off after the TARDIS explodes, and Mike as Ian, alongside 2 Daleks. London audiences have to wait until Monday for this undoubted delight, when it airs on Associated Rediffusion. June 1964. Young World Publications approached the BBC with a view to adapting Marco Polo for their Super Mag series, but this is turned down because the Express Group secure the comic strip rights for Doctor Who for their publication, TV Comic. July 1964. The Walt Disney Company approaches the BBC for the film rights to Marco Polo. 17th of August 1967. Assassin at Peking, and indeed all 7 episodes of Marco Polo, are cleared for wiping and their videotapes erased today. By the end of 1972, BBC Enterprises have wiped their prints too. August 1998. Issue 57 of Doctor Who Bulletin is published, which features 5 photographs from Assassin at Peking and 2 from Mighty Kubla Khan, which are for many years the only examples of visual material taken from the broadcast episode to exist. 1989. A film can for Assassin at Peking turns up in New Zealand. Inside, however, is not Assassin at Peking. 2004. The telesnaps for Marco Polo, bar Wall of Lies, turn up at Waris Hussein's, unearthed by researcher Derek Handley. Although there have always been plenty of stills from the rehearsals, these, the Australian shots aside, are the only clues as to what the transmitted pictures might have looked like. At the time of recording, there is still no moving footage in existence from Marco Polo. The what? The estimates for this episode are pretty good. The proposed costs of the production are £2,357, 2 shillings and threepence. The actual cost is £2,389, 13 shillings and threepence. Design and makeup are bang on budget, with performers' fees and copyright actually a bit under. It's the orchestra that really accounts for the overspend, having been estimated at £32 and 9 shillings, but actually costing £63 and 4 shillings. As mentioned, there are a massive 9 recording breaks during the performance of this episode. They are all planned, but will nonetheless have required special dispensation. Even though it largely takes place in just one location, there are action sequences and a number of costume changes to facilitate. Also, because there is only one corridor set, the cameras need to be repositioned in order to make it look like all of the running up and down them is taking place in several different ones. Listeners may wish to see this as the establishment of a much-loved tradition. Assassin Peking finds the majority of Studio D Lime Grove taken up with one giant set, the Khan's Palace at Peking. The throne room dominates and features 5 columns and a balustrade which enables the characters to look out onto the city, which is a painted 60 by 18-foot backcloth. Off it comes a corridor which runs along the side and leads to the anteroom set. There is space in the corner for the short-lived jungle set from last week, which, as before, features only a 2D mounted print of the TARDIS, because the prop itself is needed in the throne room, although it does need to be repositioned 3 times during the episode. The moving of the prop, first to the throne room to be presented to the Khan, and then out of it after it has dematerialised, provides the impetus for recording breaks 3 and 9, for example. The action begins in the forest, with the telecine reprise of most of the cliffhanger from last week, before cutting to the close-up of Tigana beckoning Ian, over which the episode title and writer captions are superimposed. Quichu's death is a late addition. It seems that with him no longer needed for the story, it was decided he may as well exit as a corpse in order to up the jeopardy. Makes it a quiet week for Tutty Lemko, who at one point was actually not required for the episode, but as he has already been contracted, it is deemed a sensible use of resources to bring him in, if only to kill him. Paul Carson fluffs on his line about remembering meeting Ian and Ping Cho at Marco Polo's caravan, but the show goes on. The first recording break comes after the big reveal of the throne room, involving a pullback and swing shot, which then tracks in on the backgammon game. In order to get all of the cameras, which have busied themselves in the jungle set thus far, into position on this large set. According to vision mixer Clive Doig, at some point during the recording of scenes on this set, one of the cameras knocks at least one of the columns over, and he has to frantically vision mix around it in order that the show goes on. The Doctor's winnings at backgammon are a delight. 35 elephants with ceremonial bridles, trappings, brocades and pavilions, 4,000 white stallions, 25 tigers, the sacred tooth of Buddha, which Polo brought from India, and all the commerce from Burma for 1 year. The Khan being terrified of his wife is also a gag, and the casting mirrors this. Claire Davenport is taller than Martin Miller, and her large, buxom frame makes her physically much more imposing than her supposedly powerful husband. In the shooting script, the Khan refers to his uncle Genghis, but this is changed to grandfather Genghis in the broadcast version. This is correct, although the scripted realisation of the name of Genghis with a J is not the more commonly used spelling or pronunciation of the most famous Khan's name, Genghis. For once, Hartnell has to make up for another actor's mistake this week. Miller is supposed to ask him if the Doctor knows Genghis Khan, but instead asks, "Did you hear of him?" which, unhelpfully, is what Hartnell is supposed to say. "I have heard of him." The lead actor just about improvs around the error. Miller is also meant to describe himself, the Khan, as the tactician of the family, but instead says statistician, which is a minor difference, but a difference nonetheless. In the final shooting script, Marco was still to accept the Khan playing for the TARDIS without any objection. But a minor interjection is added to this final broadcast version, which makes sense after all the build-up of the previous 6 weeks. Point of order. Mark Eden, as Marco Polo, follows the script and refers to TARDIS without the definite article, a rule the regulars have generally been disobeying. Indeed, Jacqueline Hill does a page later. He also moves his observation that the Doctor is a sly old fox to the beginning of his sentence in order to give it more weight. When the Doctor reveals that all he has to show for his backgammon game with the Khan is a consolation prize of paper currency, once again our hero treats a desperate situation with a fit of giggles. See The Roof of the World. These giggles take us into recording break number 2. This gives the action time to pick up sometime later, with Marco and Ian in the antechamber set, which involves moving the cameras, and Eden, who wouldn't be able to reposition in the real time required by an unbroken recording. This short scene is all that stands between recording breaks 2 and 3. The third, as mentioned previously, is required to get the TARDIS into the throne room. It's an important little scene, though, demonstrating Ping Cho's predicament and Ian's ineffectiveness against Tigana's word. It seems that Waris Hussein is not the only person slightly impatient with Derren Nesbitt's measured, almost languid delivery of his lines. In the throne room scene, Martin Miller cuts him off mid-sentence at one point, with half a line still to go. When Marco stands up to the Khan, the final performance goes even further than the script. Instead of saying, "As my lord commands," when the Emperor says he will look at his prize, he tells the Khan, "My lord, you do me great wrong," emphasising that the traveller has now seen the error of his ways and will stand up to his boss, even at risk to himself. He has finally been won over to our hero's way of thinking, even if it puts him in a position of checkmate. This excellent scene, in which the Khan admits to being prey to Tigana's power of persuasion, climaxes with the 4th recording break, which comes after a close-up of Marco, eyes closed in defeat, which then fades to black. This helps the production to suggest a passage of time and allows for camera repositioning. Another pause to acknowledge a brilliant line. The Ping Cho subplot, so tender and sad, is resolved by a gloriously dark gag. As the Khan tells her, "Your beloved husband-to-be, so anxious to be worthy of your love, drank a potion of quicksilver and sulphur, the elixir of life and eternal youth, and expired on the spot." Who needs Dennis Spooner when you have the Gagmaster General John Lucarotti? But it is not all giggles. Marco has been on a personal journey as well as a physical one. Blinded by his own desires, he trusted Tigana, and not the travellers. But his time in their presence has taught him what is important. He is even cordial when confronting the man who has tricked him. "I underestimated you, Tigana," he says, to which the warlord, smug and sly to the last, riposts as all great manoeuvrers would. "No, you overestimated yourself." Wonderful stuff. And then another recording break occurs. After the regulars have overpowered the guard, played by stuntman Roy Vincente, there is a recording break to get them back to the corridor set, and then another recording break immediately to reposition everything for the next corridor scene, which is the same set representing a different corridor. Ling Tao's timely arrival to inform Marco of Nogai's advance is not in the early drafts, and there is a recording break after this corridor scene too. Note that the vizier, like Kuitju, has no lines but is killed in this episode. As with Tatilemko, Peter Lawrence is under contract and no other BBC job has been found for him, and so he may as well be on hand. His death is another late addition to make use of this otherwise wasted resource. Tigana's line about promising Noghai to make an end of this matter was originally simply, "I pledged my sword." The script also contains a much more physical altercation between the Khan and Tigana, with the warlord pulling the emperor from his throne. "The Khan tumbles down the dais," says the script. "His gout nearly kills him with pain as he falls to the floor. Tigana goes to slay him with his sword, but is distracted by Marco's entrance. The sword blade curves down on the spot where the Khan should be, but he isn't there anymore. The old man is rolling furiously away." This is presumably simplified so as not to give undue punishment to the 64-year-old Martin Miller. After this, the action cuts to the telecine sequence of the fight, which is 1 minute and 24 seconds long. In the camera script, Khan's line admonishing Tigana and telling him he must die is not there. Instead, it is Tigana who speaks, shouting, "Long live Noghai," before impaling himself on a guard's sword. Nesbit, instead, dispatches himself silently. Marco's order to take Tigana's body is also a late addition, as is his urging that the TARDIS crew go after he has given the Doctor the keys. Ping Cho and Susan also get a slightly longer goodbye than the cursory one in the script, and then it's time for the final recording break to get the ship out of the way. Now, in the earliest version of the script, the Khan was to tell Marco that, "We shall send you home soon, Marco, to tell them of the other half," in reference to Polo's line about his countrymen not believing half of what he has seen in Cathay. But the Khan's promise is obliterated at this stage, 13th of January, and not reused in later versions of the script. The final shot takes place in a very small erection representing the inside of the TARDIS. The central control bank is there, of course, plus one solid wall and a photo blow-up. Hussein captures the shot of the regulars in their caravan using a mole camera, but we don't actually see the walls. The shot of the four is mixed in with a Starscape photo caption, and the first episode of Doctor Who to end without a cliffhanger comes to a close. But this was not the original plan. There was to be a scene in the TARDIS in which the travellers discussed their regret at not having said goodbye to Marco. They also fill in for the viewers, courtesy of history teacher Barbara, that Noghai was defeated in a war and that Polo returned home to write a famous book about his travels. The Doctor then observes that this adventure does not make it into the book, suggesting that Polo perhaps lost his notes of this particular encounter, before realising that he himself has those notes and this particular segment of Marco's diaries, and so he starts to read the volume he has brought with him. Now, in the original script, he deliberately steals it, but in the finished programme, Marco actually hands him the book, although without this scene in the ship, precisely what happens to it in the transmitted episode is likely unclear. In the early version, though, as he reads, The old man tuts at Marco's written opinion of him. "Is that what he thought of me? Well, of all the cheek." It ends as the travellers all laugh, in one of those kinds of jokey endings, before Lucarotti hands over to someone with a better knowledge of what is to come. As he writes, "The others start to laugh at Doctor Who's outraged expression. Then things start to go wrong, and the next episode begins," leaving the what starts to go wrong to either Whittaker or Terry Nation. The final revision, though, has the TARDIS coda significantly altered by David Whittaker, and has the Doctor answering Ian's query about their destination by saying that as they are on Earth, he can eliminate one of the travel dimensions, space, and simply travel forward in time. This way, they will remain on Ian and Barbara's planet of origin, which for the school teachers raises the possibility of them returning to the 20th century. Susan begs them to consider not leaving, but the Doctor postulates that he may never get a better chance to return them home, and the episode ends on Ian and Barbara in a quandary about this. But, ultimately, the final lines in the transmitted episode of Marco wondering where the travellers are now end the story on a thoughtful note, and are appropriately delivered by the man the story is named after, using dialogue penned by Whittaker. Marco's face is mixed with a photo of the galaxy, before cutting to that end shot of our heroes in their ship, heading away from Marco Polo forever. The Who. Martin Miller. Kubla Khan is played by Martin Miller, the diminutive Jewish Czechoslovakian actor who lived in Hampstead and was much liked by Waris Hussein. Miller was born Johann Rudolf Müller in the town of Kremsier in Moravia, Austro-Hungary, now called Kromeritz in the Czech Republic, to Heinrich Müller and Regina Kulka on September 2nd, 1899, making him one of the small bevy of Doctor Who contributors born in the 19th century. When he was a teenager, the family moved to Vienna. This was a common relocation for Jewish families at the time, as it offered better economic opportunities and a refuge from the anti-Semitism often found in more provincial communities. His father shared his passion for the theatre, and Miller himself was inspired to pursue a performance career after a German teacher of his was impressed by his young pupil's rendition of Goethe's poem Der Vogel. He toyed with another more secure profession first and became a professional watchmaker whilst dabbling in amateur theatre. Here he was spotted, though, and hired as a professional at the Reitmund Theatre in Vienna for the 1921-22 season, and even at this stage was using the pseudonymous moniker Martin Miller for his thespian activities. The theatre was a hotbed of Austrian talent, and for the rest of the decade he honed his talent in repertory theatre, working with some of the leading Viennese writers, actors and directors. He also dedicated some of his performance time to theatres in Czechoslovakia and Poland. The structure of the continent had changed since the family's emigration, and new states had been formed. And so the German-speaking audience he was used to performing to were now in a linguistic minority where they lived. And it was in Czechoslovakia, at the Stadt Theatre, that Miller began to blossom. From 1926 to 1931, he was a key player at the theatre, his roles including Caliban in The Tempest and the title role in Schweik, and whilst there, he also began radio broadcasts in German, something at which he would later become prolific. In Czechoslovakia, he was performing to very linguistically diverse audiences, and after the Stad Theatre, he moved to the Deutsche Theatre and then the Theatre Municipal in Strasbourg. In the mid-30s, he was also back performing and now directing too in Vienna, including playing a businessman with a Jewish background who is taken before the courts in Nazi Germany in the play Border, One Fate Amongst 60,000. Plays with anti-Semitism as a theme were on the increase, especially after the formation of the Jewish Cultural Theatre, which largely employed German Jewish actors who had been exiled from Nazi Germany, although Martin himself soon became a regular there. He was also putting on one-man shows in which he played a variety of Jewish figures from history and drama, and made a name for himself as a specialist in Jewish character acting. Politically charged work was also more permissible on the cabaret scene, and his satirical portrayals and impressions were both sharp and uncanny. But such work was already becoming risky, and Austria was annexed in 1938, which meant that Martin, as a Jew, was forbidden to act in theatre. Anyone wishing to do so had to provide proof of their Aryan descent, and the Jewish Cultural Theatre was looted and closed. And so Martin found himself leaving Austria and finding work at the only place he could, at Kubu, the Jüdischer Kulturbund, the only theatre in German-occupied territory that was allowed to employ Jews, whose ghetto theatre was located in Berlin, the centre of Third Reich operations. Rehearsals for Martin's first play there were interrupted by the Kristallnacht pogrom of the 9th and 10th of November, during which most Jewish males were imprisoned. Upon their release, audiences and morale were low. For Martin personally, though, there was triumph in the form of his third play with the company, Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, in which he gave a powerful performance as King Leontes. But life in Germany was untenable now, and in fact a number of Martin's colleagues from this time were to die in the concentration camps. The same fates would doubtless have met him had it not been for Miss Joan Howson and Miss Charlotte Townsend, Quaker stained glass artists who sponsored his emigration to the UK. They paid £50 per person on the understanding that the incomers would not be a burden on the British state, and that Miss Howson and Miss Townsend themselves would provide the accommodation in their Putney house. Miller had intended to stay for just 6 months. He arrived in England unable to speak the language, so intended to master English and then relocate to the United States, where he had a relative who had offered to support him. But he soon became a leading figure in the Austrian exile theatre, the Laterndahl, which he helped to found and which opened here in June 1939, with H.G. Wells, who, along with J.B. Priestley, was one of its patrons, in attendance. The Laterndahl was a vital component in the cohesiveness of the 30,000-strong Austrian exile community when hostilities broke out and World War II began in September 1939. Not only was the theatre creating performances, but the community it generated aimed to improve the daily life of refugees and had an eye on rebuilding Austria after the war. The Laterndahl's output was temporarily halted when theatres closed due to the danger from air raids, but not for long, and it provided the foundations for another important development in Miller's life. A young Austrian actress, Hannah Norbert, who had made it to Paris but was twice, over the course of a year, refused entry to the UK, finally became resident in London in 1939 and was well placed to become a leading lady for the Laterndahl and, in 1946, Miller's wife. Their son Daniel, now co-founder and head of the famous Mute record label, he was not born until 1951, today observes that the UK was definitely home. He never went back to Vienna, he says. London was their home. They had no intention of moving back. Before any of this, though, there was a war to be won. Miller had success directing and playing the lead role in the cabaret show The Immortal Schweik, which used the figure of Schweik from Jaroslav Hasek's creation, who used a front of stupidity to frustrate Russian militarists in World War I, and so was a good device for agitprop and satirical content. Now, it was all very well making an impact with a dislocated community with axes to grind, but Miller had his creative energies aimed further afield, and in 1940, the CBS network, from an alarmed America, contacted the BBC asking about the corporation's airing of a speech by Hitler, in which he outlined his plan to make the USA a German protectorate. The April the 1st speech, of course, there's a clue there, was not from Hitler, but in fact performed and written by Miller, and was the first of many pieces of sharp propaganda of this kind done by Miller between 1940 and 1942. This was daring stuff. Such satire had been frowned upon even in the UK, and even as the Nazis increased their power, and would definitely have blackened Miller's name back home. But such was the strength of his performance and the uncanny capturing of the Führer's enunciation and character that his reputation as an actor in the UK was cemented and spread beyond his community of exiles. Not only in the world of theatre either. Rebels and propagandists all over Europe talked about the genius of his subversive rendition of the empire-building despot, and it was a morale booster. So, on a personal and political level, Miller was making an impact. Unfortunately, the Laternal had closed in 1940, many of its artists subject to the enforced internment visited upon so-called enemy aliens. Miller then found refuge in film, making his debut on the big screen in an uncredited role in the George Formby film Let George Do It. He also debuted on the English-speaking stage in 1942's Awake and Sing at the Arts Theatre under Alec Clunes, and then had a major success as Dr. Einstein in Arsenic and Old Lace at the Strand, which ran for 4 years and cemented his reputation as an acute character player. As ever, for long lists of films you are encouraged to look at IMDb, although always with caution. But in 1943, he played his first major film role in the World War II spy drama Squadron Leader X. His other substantial roles included The Ghost of Berkeley Square in 1947 and George II in 1948's Bonnie Prince Charlie. But there were character roles and uncredited cameos in all sorts of 1940s movies, including playing the head waiter in the enduring classic The Third Man in 1949. And he continued to play character roles, some bigger than others, some credited, some not, throughout the 1950s, adding the new medium of television to his repertoire. In addition to his screen work, he also clocked up over 1,000 performances, uninterrupted for 3 years, in the long-running West End institution, Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, playing Mr. Paravicini from the very first performance of what would become an unparalleled and record-breaking run. His first Sergeant Trotter was Richard Attenborough. I didn't see much of him when I was growing up, remembers Daniel, because his father spent so much time at the theatre or was on film sets. But what I do know was that he hated learning his lines. He didn't like doing it. He would do anything to not learn his lines, anything around the house. My mum would help him. When they were not accessible is when he was learning his lines. I could hear him through the door repeating his lines and getting frustrated when he got them wrong. That said, he was a passionate storyteller, says Daniel proudly. There used to be evenings when I was very young when his refugee actor friends would come around and they'd tell stories and read poetry and prose to each other. They'd have a few drinks and a few laughs, but he was serious about acting and about his background as a German-speaking Shakespearean actor. In 1960, he played one of his many doctors in another film that has endured, Michael Powell's controversial Peeping Tom, and in 1962 he was in Hammer's The Phantom of the Opera. 1963 found him in some major productions, Nicholas Ray's 55 Days at Peking, Anthony Asquith's The VIPs, and Blake Edwards' The Pink Panther. And in 1964, of course, he played Kubla Khan in Doctor Who. Doctor Who was big at school, says Daniel. I was proud that he was in it because it was a programme that I really enjoyed, and all my friends really enjoyed. That year, he also became a regular player for ITC Productions, for whom he did turns in Danger Man, The Saint, The Baron, and in 1967, The Prisoner, in the It's Your Funeral episode, which reunited him with Marco Polo colleagues Derren Nesbitt and Mark Eden, and of course found him playing a watchmaker, which is what he had done in real life for a time. His final TV appearance was for ITC in an episode of Department S, The Perfect Operation, in which he played Professor Yuri Dutrov, which was broadcast posthumously, for he died in Austria, having been booked to appear in the film The Last Valley, but suffered a heart attack and died before completing his contribution. His role was taken by Edward Underdown, later Zaster in Doctor Who's Meglos. Miller's death was reported in a number of newspapers, with the Telegraph describing him as an outstanding stage, film and television actor. His son Daniel recalls, "I spoke to him on the phone during the shooting and he was happy to be working. He hadn't worked for a bit. But sadly he died of a heart attack on the set, so to speak. I think it's important to remember those actors like my father who came to London not speaking the language. They were good actors. They were put into what for a lot of people would have been an impossible situation and made a life and career. And they entertained people." Claire Davenport. Claire Davenport, large-framed, sometimes haughty, sometimes comical character actress who played the Empress in Marco Polo, was born on the 24th of April 1933 in Sale, Cheshire, daughter of a Lloyd's underwriter, Leslie Davenport, and his wife Hilda, née Goodyear. Hilda had excelled in amateur dramatics, and Claire wanted a taste of the theatre herself, but Leslie insisted she gain qualifications first. So she studied at St Catherine's Teacher Training College in Liverpool in order to achieve her diploma in education, and at home for an LRAM, Licentiate of the Royal Academy of Music, in speech and drama, and thanks to a determined effort, she passed first time. In between her studies, she attended the Garrick Drama School in Altrincham and acted in amateur productions, getting singled out for her chilling performance in Caesar and Cleopatra in 1954, for her excellent timing in The Hollow the following year, and for her comic roles in numerous plays during the decade. She was also a well-known performer with the Manchester Experimental Theatre Club, whilst earning her crust as a teacher at St Cyprian's in Salford for 5 years.
"Teaching is limiting,"
she said later.
"and I felt acting would be more congenial to my temperament."
Relatively late, aged 26, she won a scholarship to RADA, but left in 1962 before graduating in order to join the stage production of TV series The Rag Trade, playing Gormless North Country girl Myrtle, a role she then transferred to the screen version. She spent the rest of the decade carving out a career in repertory theatre, often in comedy roles, but also in memorable character parts. After her appearance in Doctor Who, she plugged away, maintaining a decent TV career specialising in, but not confined to, comedy support.
"I thought I'd be too big for telly,"
she said.
"but I'm learning the medium, and it has also taught me a vast amount about light entertainment. No one tries to emote in corners, and there's no temperament. Everyone just gets on with the job."
Her qualifications came in useful when she was resting, as she continued supply teaching between engagements. She gave ballast to everyone from Tommy Cooper to Reeves and Mortimer via Reg Varney and Dick Emery. For the latter, she excelled in the role as his bossy wife in The Dick Emery Show. She also turned up in George and the Dragon, Mind Your Language, On the Buses, Sink or Swim with Peter Davison, and the famous The Germans episode of Fawlty Towers. She was one of the first actresses to appear nude on British television in the 1968 play The Life Class as model Miss Bliss. She wasn't fazed by such an engagement.
"I wasn't a bit embarrassed, but the director was. He put a boil plaster over each of my nipples. I thought it rather strange."
On the big screen, she was, therefore, soon associated with the saucier end of the cinematic, with roles in Adventures of a Plumber's Mate and Carry On Emmanuel, and as another life model in Birth of the Beatles. She also had a blossoming under the artistic eye of director Derek Jarman, appearing in his films Jubilee and The Tempest, the latter as a totally nude, suckling Sycorax. She was also in David Lynch's film The Elephant Man, and claimed a place in one of the other sci-fi halls of fame by appearing as the, and this is what it says in the credits, fat dancer at Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. A series of strokes hampered her later career, and she spent her last years battling ill health. When she died, aged 68 in 2002, her friend, the time-flight actor, and at the time of recording, member of the House of Lords, Michael Cashman, paid tribute, saying, "She lived for her friends, acting and art. The fact she died at just 68 is tragic, and the acting business is all the poorer for Claire not being around. Claire was wonderful, says Waris Hussein, so over the top. We used to send her up rotten. I'll never forget her. Waris Hussein. Assassin at Peking was to be the last contribution to Doctor Who of one of its key architects, Waris Hussein. Hussein was born Waris Habibullah in Lucknow, India, in December 1938, the son of Ali Bahadur Habibullah, later a member of the Indian High Commission, and the writer Atiya Hussain. Waris was brought up in Bombay, where he was transfixed by the Hollywood films shown in the cinema there. The family moved to the UK in 1946, and Waris remained there with his mother after his father's return to India after independence. Atiya was now working for the BBC's Eastern Service. Waris then studied as a boarder at Clifton College in Bristol, a public school with a great tradition of theatre. The Bristol Old Vic was close by, providing succour for the hungry theatregoer. Waris left in 1957, then attending Queen's College, Cambridge, where he directed a number of plays, including productions featuring his contemporary, Ian McKellen. He graduated and originally planned to be an actor, but a spell at Nottingham Rep convinced him that his future lay out of the limelight. I failed abysmally, he says, because I wasn't very good. In 1960, he applied to join the BBC as a potential trainee. This is the first time I actually became aware of my ethnicity, he says, because although they were interested, they asked him about working in broadcasting in the Far East. I realised what they were doing was they were offering me a job in my country of origin because I was born in India but brought up in England. And I saw where they were coming from. And I said in a rather arrogant way, I actually want to go into television and not waste your time and my talent. That was a pretty daring thing to say, but I needed to say it. Television. Well, I was 20-something years old. Television at that time was peopled by some very senior directors, all in their 40s and 50s and 60s. So for me to ask to get into this Fort Knox of directing was quite daring, and I had to go for multiple interviews. Eventually, he was rejected and faced the prospect of going through with appearing in the science fiction series The Andromeda Breakthrough as a telephone operator. He'd put his face about for possible castings, and indeed had appeared in a 1962 episode of Corrigan Blake. But someone dropped out of the director's course, and so his TV science fiction debut ended up being a little more illustrious. But first, he had to do his 6 months training, and upon completion of that, he was welcomed to the BBC as a director, having learned his craft under its watchful benevolence. Ethnicity aside, he was also very young and very junior. I could feel the eyes boring into me, laser-like, wondering what the hell this kid was doing here. On October the 16th, 1962, his first directing credit appeared on television screens, an episode of magazine-based soap Compact, for which he would helm 10 episodes in all over the next year. In early 1963 came an episode of Suspense, and then in July there was an episode of Moonstrike, in which he cast Eileen Way, later the old mother of the Cave People segment in An Unearthly Child. His Sunday play, The Shadow of Mart, also in July, featured Mark Eden, and then there was time for a bit more Compact before he was whisked away into time and space. And so came Doctor Who, for which he was picked by Sidney Newman to help another bright young thing, Verity Lambert, to see this precocious child of a programme come kicking and screaming into this world. The details of this are covered in previous instalments of Too Much Information. Once he left Doctor Who, Waris Hussein's career soared. Having proved himself on jobs he felt were slightly beneath a highly literate Cambridge graduate, Trevor Nunn had been a contemporary and collaborator, he was aiming for what he saw as more elevated work. And although he did some typical BBC fare, The Newcomers and the India Tales of Rudyard Kipling, he enjoyed a lot of early collaborations on The Wednesday Play with writer Simon Gray, who was then living in a Coldwater flat off Finchley Road. Working with him was a pleasure, Hussein recalls. Simon was very aware of the oddness of human beings, and his scripts were very odd. He wrote the first play about homosexuality, which nobody talked about. It was called Spoiled. I'm so sad that the Simon Gray plays I directed have all gone. He also directed classics, such as St. Joan, Hedda Gabler, and a personal favourite of his, A Passage to India, which even today he cites as a high point of his career. Fortunately, this still exists, unlike a lot of work from that time. It's black and white and a bit fuzzy, but I'm very proud of it. I think I did justice to E.M. Forster's book. My version, shot on tape, has more going for it in terms of the intention of E.M. Forster's novel than the film by David Lean, if I dare say so. Hussein was often earmarked for works about controversial topics. He is always attracted, he says, to stories about outsiders, and another Gray play, Sleeping Dog, tackled the subject of racism. His first film came at the end of the 1960s. A Touch of Love starred recent Oscar winner Sandy Dennis and provided his Cambridge contemporary Ian McKellen with his first major film role. This led to a decade or so of high-end work on the big and small screen. Films included Melody, written by Alan Parker, with music by the Bee Gees. It was the first film produced by David Putnam, and this led to his first American movie, Quackster Fortune Has a Cousin in the Bronx. The possession of Joel Delaney, which he found a rather frightening experience, actually convinced him to never work on anything again involving the supernatural. TV included Divorce His, Divorce Hers, which was a bit of a disaster. Stars Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were falling out, and both took their ire out on the director, who bore the brunt of ABC Television's dislike of the final product. Whilst he was in hiding and bruised from this experience, Verity Lambert, by then producing for Thames Television, called him and asked him to return to the UK to direct Shoulder to Shoulder about the suffragette movement, with Lambert fighting to get Hussein hired, even though there was pressure for a woman to be given the reins. Lambert assured her colleagues that Hussein was very good with women, and the series ended up being a happy engagement. Verity saw to it that I was resurrected, he says, after his parlous time with Burton and Taylor. Another triumph was the Cambridge undergraduate series The Glittering Prizes, 1976, which starred Tom Conti, Clive Merrison and Nigel Havers. The Glittering Prizes has endured, as has Edward and Mrs. Simpson, 1978, in which he thought Edward Fox, his Edward, was amazing, and which was a piece of work he is still very proud of. The serial involved a lot of preparation, even though his Mrs. Simpson, Cynthia Harris, was cast in panic at the last minute after a dropout, and yet proved to be a very successful booking. Hussein himself wasn't involved in that process. He credits it to the wily operating of one Verity Lambert, who was pulling some strings in order for that to happen, the old pair back together again. The success of The Glittering Prizes, which was sold to PBS with great success, led to interest in Hussein from America. And so he was on his way to work on US TV on a TV film called Death Penalty, another racially charged story about a young boy accused of murder. He had hoped to direct a production of Staying On with Wendy Hiller for Granada, but for various reasons this didn't happen, which he feels resulted in him not being asked to be the first director of the hugely successful TV version of Jewel in the Crown. Waris was asked to be the second director on the show, but pride led to him turning it down. He did, however, get to work in America again instead, thanks to his Death Penalty star Colleen Dewhurst, and then he was back in the UK working with Laurence Olivier on Laurence Olivier Presents. He also worked with Sir John Gielgud, by the way, who played the Inquisitor for him in his TV St. Joan, as well as in the theatre, trailblazing as the first director of Indian origin to oversee a national theatre play, in this case Half-Life, in 1978. And so he was a director at the top of his game, working on multiple projects in the United States, including the TV movie version of Barry Manilow's Copacabana, winning a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Direction in a music or variety programme. He continued to take on subjects of import. In the UK in 1987, Intimate Contact was a stark drama about AIDS, starring Daniel Massey and Claire Bloom, a 4-part examination of its effect on a middle-class heterosexual, not the demographic usually associated with the condition at that time. For Hussein himself, this was a very personal experience, as he lost his own long-term partner to the virus. He also took great pride in his work on Sixth Happiness, which was about disability. It went out opposite the Olympics when broadcast on the BBC, and sadly didn't make the impact that he had hoped it would. His 1994 Screen 2, The Clothes in the Wardrobe, snagged him a BAFTA for Best TV Drama, to go along with the one he won for Best Drama Series for Edward and Mrs. Simpson in 1979, and he continued working until 2002. Since then, he's been a generous contributor to projects such as this, and indeed provided us with just enough information, not too much, for this mini-biography. I want to give full credit to my mum, he says, who, in the cliched way, when father was getting very impatient, would say, "Let the boy develop his artistic temperament." She encouraged me in every way. She was immensely proud of me. Considering his successes, he says that, "I've learned by working with superb performers that a good actor can be an absolute godsend to a director. They can save you from all sorts of problems." And although he moved on from Doctor Who, he's moved back in recent years, actively helping out as advisor on Mark Gatiss' An Adventure in Space and Time, in which he was played by Sacha Dhawan, and taking an interest in the new series. It is the house style of Too Much Information, because a lot of our quotations are gleaned from contemporary documents or newspaper interviews, to have just two voices, one male, one female, representing everyone. But it seems appropriate as he has given his time so generously, and because this episode marks the departure from Doctor Who of this key figure, that some of the concluding words on Marco Polo are given over to its director, Waris Hussein himself.
I think it was good, but I wish I could say why. But the fact is, I mourn the loss of that show. A lot of my BBC work, by the way, has disappeared, have gone. They've all been wiped. For me, that was a very important piece of work. But the Marco Polo, as you know, has disappeared. No one quite knows what happened to the show. I'm very proud of it, actually, because it was epic in its concept. And John Lucarotti, who wrote it, did a lot of research historically into what he could find about Marco Polo. He tried to use it without becoming too much of a lecture for us. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It was fascinating, and I learned much more about, because by working on something like that, you get educated, and I learned so much about Marco Polo's journeys.
And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. What's Tigana's game, says the dialogue at one point. Well, Marco Polo, the story, is one long game, or indeed, a number of them. It's certainly a game of risk, with Tigana concentrating everyone on his own actions in order to give Nogai, off-screen, the chance to move his pieces into position. But then, despite Assassinate Peking being the action-packed climax of this often measured story, well, it's also a strategic game of chess, a match between Tigana, Marco, and the TARDIS crew. But it's not all strategy and planning. This is an episode with plenty of humour at its core. Just as it looks like it'll all be wrapped up neatly, the Doctor, trouncing Kubla Khan at another board game of manoeuvring, backgammon, seems all set to win the TARDIS back, and he loses the all-important final game. It's funny, but it also lands them back at square one. Oh, it's snakes and ladders now. There's also some interesting cultural education, albeit from a Western perspective, about the nature of arranged marriages. But I don't think it's too hard to disagree with the script's sympathy for Ping Cho's predicament, though this too is resolved, and humorously to boot. But it's been a story about decency and honour, and about keeping one's word. Marco, only ever a benign but no less intransigent barricade to the traveller's escape from a time they don't belong in, finally comes good. It's hard not to cheer his confession to the Khan that his claim over the TARDIS is an unjust one, motivated by selfishness, making him the hero of this story several scenes before he also bags the action sequence for himself as well. He certainly deserves to have the story named after him, no matter what random bits of BBC paperwork might say. What the Khan fears about Tigana is his power of persuasion, and that's a lovely exchange, and it is persuasion, gently, over 7 episodes, that finally makes Marco do the right thing. For all the murder, swordplay and trickery, words here are the most powerful weapons in a serious and literate script that does psychology so very well. And rather than have some contrived cliffhanger, this thoughtful tale doesn't end with any hastily convened jeopardy, but instead leaves our travellers an abstract thought in the mind of this story's hero, Marco Polo, whose escapades the regulars have been visitors to. The final sword fight might deny them agency, but as with the very first story, it has them running for their lives, very much footprints in a time where they don't belong. This sort of denouement couldn't have endured. The heroes need to be responsible for some of the story's conclusion, but at this stage, it emphasises the fraught nature of the environments and situations our heroes find themselves in, and shows them powerless against larger, more universal forces than 4 such creatures of flesh and blood can compete with. Oh, and I wonder where they are now. The past or the future. Doctor Who, Assassin at Peking. Featured Xenia Merton as Ping Cho, Tati Lemko as Quit Ju, Paul Carson as Ling Tao, Martin Miller as Kubla Khan, Claire Davenport as the Empress, and Peter Lawrence as the Vizier. The sword fight was arranged by Derek Ware. The title music was by Ron Grainer and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Tristram Carey. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer, Barry Newbury, and the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, another hostile environment with a beach made of glass and a sea made of acid as the series goes science fiction again, and that Dalek bloke returns. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Sea of Death, or Acid, Rubber and Glass, if you're into that kind of thing. Too Much Information, Assassin at Peking, was written and performed by me, Toby Haydock. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone. And it has been made with thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, Susanna Gostimitrovic, Sinead McCloskey, Patrick Mulkern, the late Derek Ware, Rhys Williams, and there are special thanks due to Daniel Miller and Waris Hussein. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music for Too Much Information has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, 1 per story, as opposed to per episode, far too much information that is for now exclusive to patrons who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with Happy Times and Places, which is another podcast of mine, so if you want to hear TV presenter and buff workman Stephen Cranford getting all hot and bothered by the hairy situations in the Stones of Blood, or DVD producer extraordinaire Ed Stradling waxing lyrical about resurrection of the Daleks, then head over to patreon.com/Toby Haydock right now. References. Thanks so much to all who've helped with this edition of Too Much Information, notably Waris Hussein and Daniel Miller, who both kindly agreed to be interviewed. Waris is a noted TV director and Doctor Who icon, whilst Daniel is the founder and head of Mute Records, and therefore a very big deal indeed, and yet they both gave their time extremely generously and for no fee to this rather arcane corner of internet broadcasting. The Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller archive has been collated in the Austrian Jewish Exile Theatre Collection, and I'm indebted to the work of archivist Claire George for making this accessible. Her blog, which goes into more detail about Miller and his experiences, and those of other Hungarian Jewish artists seeking refuge in the UK, can be found at norbertmiller.wordpress.com and is recommended further reading. But this is mostly a secondary sources kind of gig, and so I'm indebted to Doctor Who, The Complete History, edited by John Ainsworth and Mark Wright, which has material from Richard Atkinson, Alistair McGowan and Johnny Morris. And of course, Howe, Stammers and Walker, with their early works with Doctor Who the 60s and the Doctor Who handbooks, are always worth looking at for the information that we now take for granted about this era. Patrick Mulkern wrote 3 shining examples of excellent research about one particular story, fortunately for us, Marco Polo, going into detail by poring over paperwork with the director, Waris Hussein, over 3 issues of Doctor Who magazine, starting from number 483 in 2015, and has kindly answered any questions arising from those articles when I've put them to him. David Brunt is also very handy when it comes to arcane questions or paperwork requests at ridiculous hours, and Simon Guerrier has been kind enough to share his research and collation of Season 1 material, which was the foundation of his excellent new book on David Whittaker, which is highly recommended. For more information about Claire Davenport, I can recommend the website ritaweb.co.uk, which has a full film and TVography and is a shrine to eccentric TV character ladies. I've also pored over newspaper files from various online resources that you have to pay for, and of course Doctor Who magazine, and websites like Shannon Patrick Sullivan's A Brief History of Time Travel and BBC Genome are very helpful to corroborate facts without one having to wade through physical paperwork. I walk in the shadows of giants who, if they did leave an imprint in the snow, well, it'd probably be of a BBC production file or a back issue of the Radio Times. I would like to thank the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Joel Aarons, Joanne Abbott, Keith Adams, Mark Aldridge, Kit Allen, Neil Allen, Sebastian April, Tilt Eraser, Radit Aritza, Endaf Arwin, Simon Ash, Richard Alt, P. Baker, Richard Baker, John Ball, Stephen Bamford, Simon Barker, Ollie Barrett, Andy Benison, Richard Bignell, Peter Blackett, Robin Bland, Gareth Bowley, David Brodie, Hugh Bookman, Tim Burrows, DC, Jim Cameron, Paul Carrington, Anthony Carroll, Damien Cartin, Phil Chapman, Ralph Chilton, Susan Christian, Steve Churchill, Kevin Clark, Graham Cluley, Mark Cockram, Charles Coffin, Simon Coling, Ben Cook, Martin Cook, Matt Corner, Leslie Coots, Ben Cowdell, Philip Craggs, Oliver Crocker, Sarah Crutzer, David Crew, Steve Cunniff, Dave Cullen, Simon Curtis, Paul Philip Dahlgren, Rob Dawson, Chris Davis, Hugh Davis, Robert Davies, Shanty Day, Ian Dean, Tim Dickinson, Sean Ditchfield, Graham, don't have your surname, Graham, Paul Greaves and Robin Grove. So I've already plugged Patreon, patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. You can also support my endeavours at kofi.com/Toby Haydoke. That requires no monthly subscription or anything, and what costs you nothing if you'd like to help out, but are not in a position or inclined to do so financially, and that's absolutely fine. I'm really grateful to you for listening. If you could give these 5-star ratings and a few lines of review wherever you get them from, particularly Apple, iTunes and places like that, it is really, really helpful. And tell your friends by going on to cyberspace. You can follow these podcasts at Haydoke Podcasts. I have my own feed at Toby Haydoke. I'm on Instagram at toby.haydoke, and I have a Facebook page as well. And anything nice you can say out there in cyberspace, well, it just tweaks the old algorithms, and I'm getting old, and the occasional tweaking of my algorithms isn't too much to ask.